Vietnam, 1968, an Australian corporal commanded 10 men through ambushes and firefights, making split-second tactical decisions. Meanwhile, 50 kilometres away, a US Army sergeant with the same responsibilities had received 1/10 the training. The difference wasn't talent, it was 9 months versus 8 weeks, and it changed everything. The Australian section commander holds one of the most demanding leadership positions in modern infantry warfare. A corporal, typically 22 to 24 years old, directly commands 7 to 10 soldiers in combat. This span of command equals or exceeds that of officers commanding entire subunits. Yet the preparation for this role differed dramatically between Allied forces during the Vietnam War. Australian corporals underwent 9 months of intensive training at facilities like the Jungle Warfare Training Centre at Canungra, accumulating 600 to 800 hours of tactical instruction. American troops deploying to the same conflict received 8 weeks of basic training, often totaling fewer than 100 hours of comparable tactical preparation. The results on the battlefield told the story, but how did this gap emerge and what made the Australian training system so effective? Consider the complexity. A 23-year-old corporal leads a section through hostile jungle. He must read terrain, assess threats, make tactical decisions, manage ammunition and water, coordinate with adjacent sections, call for fire support, treat casualties, and maintain morale among soldiers who were his peers months earlier. He has 7 direct reports. A company commander typically has 6. This is the first leadership position the Australian Army assigns, yet it demands skills that take years to master. The question becomes, how do you compress that development into the time available before deployment? The Australian approach centred on the Jungle Warfare Training Centre at Canungra, Queensland, established in 1942 and continuously refined through the Malayan Emergency Borneo confrontation and Vietnam War. Training duration for Australian soldiers deploying to Vietnam averaged 9 months from enlistment to operational readiness. This period included basic military skills, corps-specific trade training, and intensive jungle warfare preparation. The Canungra facility provided between 600 and 800 hours of tactical training, specifically focused on the conditions soldiers would face in Southeast Asian operations. Section commander training for corporals emphasised mission command principles long before the term gained widespread use in military doctrine. Australian training doctrine recognised that section commanders operated with considerable autonomy once patrols left base. Communications technology of the era meant corporals made tactical decisions without constant oversight from platoon or company headquarters. Training reflected this reality. Exercises at Canungra placed section commanders in scenarios requiring independent decision-making under pressure, with instructors evaluating not just the decision outcome, but the thought process behind it. The Australian system also recognised leadership as distinct from technical military skills. While American training often conflated the two, Australian doctrine separated them. A soldier first mastered infantry skills, then attended specific leadership courses that addressed the human dimension of command. The Junior Leader course, introduced in the early 1960s, provided explicit leadership training focused on understanding soldier needs, building team cohesion, and managing the transition from peer to leader. This course typically occurred after 12 months of service, allowing soldiers to observe leadership in practice before assuming leadership roles themselves. Physical and mental resilience training formed another pillar of Australian preparation. Canungra's tropical environment, with its heat, humidity, heavy vegetation, and challenging terrain, replicated conditions in Vietnam more accurately than any American facility. Soldiers trained in 90-degree heat with 90% humidity while carrying full combat loads. Navigation exercises required moving through thick jungle with limited visibility. Ambush drills were conducted during torrential rain. This environmental conditioning meant Australian soldiers arrived in Vietnam already acclimatised to conditions that shocked newly arrived American troops. The American training system operated under different constraints and assumptions, US Army basic combat training in the 1960s lasted 8 weeks at facilities such as Fort Polk, Louisiana, or Fort Benning, Georgia. This training covered fundamental military skills including marksmanship, physical fitness, military courtesy, and basic tactics. Advanced individual training added additional weeks for specific military occupational specialties, but total pre-deployment training rarely exceeded 4 months. Jungle warfare training for soldiers heading to Vietnam improved as the war progressed, but early in the conflict many troops received minimal preparation for tropical conditions. Fort Polk eventually established a jungle training facility, but time constraints meant courses lasted only 2 to 3 weeks, rather than the months-long preparation Australian soldiers experienced. American training hours for tactical skills typically totaled fewer than 100 hours before deployment, compared to 600 to 800 hours for Australians. The difference extended beyond duration to philosophy. American doctrine of the Vietnam era emphasized overwhelming firepower and rapid response enabled by helicopter mobility. Small unit leaders were trained to call for support rather than rely on independent tactical decision-making. Radio communications technology allowed company and battalion commanders to directly control actions at the section and squad level. This created a more centralized command structure where junior leaders executed orders rather than developed tactical solutions independently. Leadership training in the US system was often embedded within technical training rather than treated as a separate discipline. Squad leaders typically received their positions based on time in service and technical proficiency rather than completing dedicated leadership courses. The assumption was that soldiers would learn leadership by observing more senior NCOs and through trial and error. Once in position, this tacit knowledge transfer model worked when units had stable personnel and sufficient time for junior leaders to develop, but rapid personnel rotation during Vietnam disrupted this traditional system. Another factor was age and maturity. Australian section commanders averaged 22 to 24 years old when assuming command, having spent at least 12 to 18 months in service. Many American squad leaders were 19 to 21 years old with less accumulated experience. The Australian system's longer preparation period provided not just more training hours, but additional time for personal maturity that proved valuable when making life and death decisions under fire. The philosophical difference between Australian and American approaches manifested most clearly in command doctrine. Australian forces practiced what would later be formalised as mission command, though the term did not exist in doctrine during the Vietnam War. Section commanders received a mission objective and constraints, but considerable freedom in how to accomplish the task. Planning for section-level operations emphasised understanding commanders' intent 2 levels up, allowing corporals to adapt to changing situations without awaiting new orders. This decentralised approach required section commanders to think critically about tactical problems. Australian training deliberately created ambiguous scenarios where no single correct solution existed. Instructors evaluated how section commanders analysed terrain, assessed enemy capabilities, considered available resources, and developed plans that balanced mission accomplishment with force protection. After-action reviews focused on decision-making process as much as outcome, reinforcing the habit of analytical thinking under pressure. The concept that Leonard Wong at the US Army War College later termed the strategic corporal was embedded in Australian training long before the term existed. Instructors taught section commanders that their actions had implications beyond immediate tactical success. How a patrol treated civilians affected population attitudes toward government forces. How casualties were handled affected section morale for weeks. How prisoners were treated affected enemy willingness to surrender in future engagements. Australian section commanders learned to consider these second and third order effects when making decisions. Mission command doctrine also required section commanders to develop subordinates capable of assuming command if the leader became a casualty. Australian sections practiced what was termed succession planning, where the section second in command and senior lance corporal were deliberately included in planning and briefings. This ensured continuity of command and distributed knowledge throughout the section rather than concentrating it in the section commander alone. American squads sometimes practiced similar approaches, but it was not formalized in doctrine or training to the same degree. The autonomy granted to Australian section commanders came with accountability. After-action reviews were detailed and frank, with instructors and senior NCOs providing direct feedback on decisions made during exercises. This created a culture where section commanders learned to articulate and defend their tactical choices while remaining open to feedback and alternative approaches. The combination of autonomy in execution with accountability in review developed decision makers who were confident but not reckless. The effects of training differences became measurable in combat outcomes. Australian forces in Vietnam achieved kill ratios consistently around 12-1, meaning 12 enemy casualties for every Australian casualty. American forces, while achieving tactical success in most engagements, recorded kill ratios closer to 5-1. These statistics, compiled from official after-action reports and unit records, reflected numerous factors including tactics, equipment and operational environment, but training quality remained a significant variable. Australian section commanders demonstrated consistent ability to maintain fire discipline, navigate accurately in difficult terrain, and adapt tactics to unexpected situations. Combat reports from Australian units note section commanders making independent tactical decisions when separated from higher headquarters during extended patrols. These included decisions to break contact when ambushed from superior positions, to alter patrol routes based on terrain assessment, and to call for fire support at critical moments without waiting for approval from platoon level. One measurable outcome was casualty rates from ambushes. Australian doctrine emphasised counter-ambush drills practiced repeatedly until they became automatic responses. When Australian patrols were ambushed, trained reactions typically saw sections assault through the kill zone immediately, while other sections provided covering fire. This aggressive response, though counterintuitive, reduced casualties by disrupting the ambush before enemy forces could concentrate effective fire. American units sometimes employed similar tactics, but the consistency and speed of Australian counter-ambush drills, honed through hundreds of repetitions during training, produced measurably lower casualty rates in these engagements. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, consisting of approximately 100 warrant officers and SNCOs, who trained South Vietnamese units from 1962 through 1972, provided another data point. AATTV members selected from the most experienced Australian soldiers consistently received recognition from American commanders for their effectiveness in developing local forces. 4 Victoria Crosses, Australia's highest military decoration, were awarded to AATTV members, reflecting the calibre of soldiers produced by the Australian training system. Section commanders who survived initial combat deployments gained experience that made them increasingly effective. Australian units maintained lower rotation rates than American units, allowing experienced section commanders to serve longer in position and pass knowledge to less experienced leaders. This institutional continuity meant lessons learned remained within units rather than departing when individuals rotated home. The Australian training system's effectiveness came with costs and limitations. 9 months of training per soldier required substantial investment in training infrastructure, instructor personnel, and facilities. For a smaller military like Australia's, this meant training throughput was limited. The Australian commitment to Vietnam peaked at approximately 8,000 personnel, modest compared to the over 500,000 American troops deployed at the war's height. The intensive training model simply could not scale to produce soldiers in the numbers the United States required. There were also questions about whether 9 months represented optimal training duration or reflected bureaucratic inertia and tradition. Some Australian military theorists during the period argued that training could be compressed without significant loss of effectiveness. The debate centred on whether all components of the 9-month period provided proportional value or if some elements could be streamlined. The longer training period also meant soldiers spent more time preparing for deployment and less time actually deployed. This affected both operational readiness and soldier retention. Some soldiers who enlisted expecting rapid deployment to operations became frustrated with extended training periods. The trade-off between thorough preparation and timely deployment remained a tension throughout the war. Another consideration was training's focus on infantry skills and jungle warfare. While this prepared soldiers excellently for Vietnam, it provided less broad military education and systems emphasising diverse operational environments. As conflicts evolved beyond Southeast Asian jungles, questions arose about whether the Australian model required adaptation for other theatres. Finally, the intensive training system worked partly because it drew from a conscript pool augmenting a professional volunteer force. National service in Australia provided a broader personnel base than an all-volunteer force might sustain. This raised questions about whether the model could persist after conscription ended in 1972. The Australian section commander training model influenced military education doctrine globally in subsequent decades. The concept of mission command that Australian forces practiced informally became formalised NATO doctrine by the 1980s. The emphasis on developing junior leaders capable of independent decision-making spread through Western militaries as the complexity of modern operations increased. The strategic corporal concept articulated by US Marine Corps General Charles Krulak in 1990 described the situation Australian training had prepared section commanders for 30 years earlier. Krulak's observation that junior leaders' actions could have strategic implications merely codified what Australian doctrine had recognised during Vietnam. That section commanders needed education beyond basic tactics to operate effectively in complex environments where military, political and humanitarian considerations intersected. Contemporary military training for junior leaders across many Western militaries reflects Australian approaches from the Vietnam era. Longer training durations, separation of leadership training from technical skills development, emphasis on decision-making under uncertainty, and realistic training environments all appear in current programs. The United States Army's Ranger School, though serving different purposes than basic section commander training, incorporates many principles Australian training emphasised: physical and mental stress, ambiguous scenarios, leadership under austere conditions, and peer evaluation. Australian Defence Force training continues to emphasise section commander development as a critical capability. Current doctrine explicitly recognises section commanders as the foundation of combined arms operations. The Army Research Centre has published studies on section command leadership, tactical decision-making at junior levels, and professional military education for JNCOs, all building on principles established during the Vietnam era. The broader lesson extended beyond specific tactics or training methods. It demonstrated that systematic investment in junior leader development produced measurable battlefield effectiveness. Organisations that prioritised section commander quality gave them training and authority to make decisions and held them accountable for outcomes created more effective small units. Australian military performance in Vietnam influenced how allies viewed Australian Defence Force capabilities. American commanders consistently praised Australian units for professionalism and effectiveness. This reputation enhanced Australia's position in regional security arrangements and alliance relationships. The demonstration that a middle power military could achieve outsized effectiveness through training excellence rather than numerical superiority provided a model for other nations with similar strategic constraints. The training system's success also validated investment in professional military education at all levels. Australian defence policy in subsequent decades maintained emphasis on training quality even as budget pressures mounted. The institutional memory that thorough preparation, reduced casualties and increased effectiveness remained influential in resource allocation decisions. For individual soldiers, the training provided confidence that proved as valuable as specific skills. Section commanders who trusted their preparation adapted more readily to combat's chaos and uncertainty. This psychological dimension of training, harder to quantify than skills acquisition, represented perhaps the most important difference between training systems. The 9 months versus 8 weeks comparison represented more than a simple difference in training duration. It reflected fundamentally different approaches to preparing junior leaders for the complexity of modern warfare. Australian doctrine recognised that section commanders, though junior in rank, held positions requiring maturity, judgment and decision-making skills comparable to those demanded of officers. The training system reflected that recognition through dedicated time, resources and attention to developing these qualities. The results, measured in combat effectiveness and lives saved, validated the investment. Sometimes 9 months makes all the difference. If you want more analysis of real military training and tactics, subscribe. Comment below. What other training systems should be compared? Until then.